For perhaps 60,000 years, they have remained untouched by the outside world. No roads, no electricity, no contact. On a small island in the Bay of Bengal lives a people who have rejected civilization entirely. This is their story, and why we may never know it. The Island Frozen in Time, North Sentinel Island, Vertical Bar, Sleep Documentary, Part 1, Intro. Somewhere in the Bay of Bengal, 72 square kilometers of forest have remained untouched by the modern world. The people who live there have never used metal they did not find washed ashore. They have never planted a crop. They have never built a permanent structure beyond simple lean-tos of leaves and branches. They are the Sentinelese, and they have chosen, for perhaps 60,000 years, to remain alone. This is not a story of a lost tribe waiting to be discovered. The Sentinelese know the outside world exists. They have seen helicopters circle overhead. They have watched ships pass along the horizon. They have encountered outsiders on their beaches, arriving with coconuts and gifts, and they have made their position clear. They do not want contact. They have defended their isolation with arrows and spears, with unwavering consistency, for as long as recorded history can document. North Sentinel Island sits just 50 kilometers west of the Andaman Islands, a chain of nearly 600 islands stretching between Myanmar and Indonesia. Commercial shipping lanes pass within sight of its shores. International flights cross overhead daily. The 21st century flows around it on every side. Yet the island itself remains frozen in time, a place where the Paleolithic era never ended, where fire is still kept alive rather than created, where the bow and arrow represent the height of technology. Tonight, we trace the complete history of this remarkable place, not through the eyes of its inhabitants, whose story remains their own, but through the documented encounters, the colonial records, the anthropological expeditions, and the tragic incidents that have shaped what little the outside world knows about the most isolated people on Earth. This is the island frozen in time. Origins. The story of North Sentinel Island begins not hundreds but tens of thousands of years ago, during a period when the world looked fundamentally different from the one we know today. Sea levels sat roughly 120 meters lower than they do now. Land bridges connected territories that today sit separated by vast stretches of ocean, and small bands of humans were undertaking one of the most remarkable migrations in the history of our species. The ancestors of the Sentinelese were part of what anthropologists call the Great Coastal Migration. Beginning perhaps 70,000 years ago, groups of anatomically modern humans began moving out of Africa, following coastlines eastward. They did not travel in large, organized expeditions. They moved slowly, generation by generation, following the resources of the shore. Fish, shellfish, the predictable bounty of tidal zones. Genetic evidence suggests that the Andamanese peoples, including the Sentinelese, descend from some of the earliest humans to leave Africa. Their DNA carries markers that connect them to the first wave of migration into Asia, making them among the most ancient continuous populations outside the African continent. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 26,000 years ago, the Andaman Islands were not the scattered archipelago we see today. Lower sea levels meant larger land masses. Islands that now sit kilometers apart were connected or separated by only narrow channels. The ancestors of today's Sentinelese likely walked to their current home, or crossed only short stretches of water in simple rafts or canoes. Then the ice began to melt. Sea levels rose steadily over the following millennia. The land bridges disappeared. The large connected territories fragmented into the hundreds of islands that exist today, and the populations living on them became isolated from one another. This isolation is the key to understanding the Sentinelese. They did not choose to reject the outside world from a position of knowledge. They simply never needed it. Their island provided everything required for survival. Fresh water flows from the interior. The surrounding reef teems with fish. The forest offers wild fruits, honey, and the larvae of beetles. The Sentinelese developed a way of life perfectly adapted to their environment, and that way of life proved sustainable for tens of thousands of years. The outside world, meanwhile, remained entirely unaware of their existence until remarkably recently. The Andaman Islands appear in ancient texts, but only as vague references to dangerous shores. Arab traders in the 9th century described the islands as inhabited by cannibals, a claim repeated and embellished over the following centuries with no evidence whatsoever. Chinese records from the same period mention the islands as a navigation hazard, a place where ships should not anchor. These accounts reflect not reality, but fear. The Andaman Islanders, including the Sentinelese, did resist outside contact. They did attack ships that approached their shores, but the lurid descriptions of their behavior served more to justify avoiding them than to document actual practices. For the Sentinelese specifically, isolation was even more complete. Their island sits at the western edge of the Andaman chain, separated from the main group by open water. Ships passing through the region had no reason to approach such a small, reef-ringed landmass when larger islands with better anchorages lay nearby. The first definite European reference to the Andaman Islands comes from Marco Polo, who passed near them in 1290 while traveling from China to Persia. He did not land. He described the inhabitants as having heads like dogs and consuming anyone they could capture. This was fantasy, borrowed from earlier Arab accounts and mixed with medieval European beliefs about the monstrous races thought to inhabit the edges of the known world. For nearly 500 years after Marco Polo, the Andaman Islands remained a blank space on European maps. Occasional ships wrecked on their reefs, and the survivors who made it to shore rarely returned to tell their stories. The islands developed a reputation among sailors as a place of death, to be avoided at all costs. This reputation protected the Sentinelese more effectively than any barrier of their own making. While other isolated peoples around the world fell under colonial control during the Age of Exploration, the Andaman Islanders remained largely untouched. The Portuguese established themselves in nearby Goa in 1510. The Dutch built their trading empire through the Indonesian archipelago. The British consolidated control over the Indian subcontinent, yet the Andaman Islands, sitting squarely within one of the busiest trading routes in the world, remained outside all of it. The first sustained European interest in the Andaman Islands came in 1789, when the British East India Company sent Lieutenant Archibald Blair to survey the archipelago for a potential naval base and penal colony. Blair spent several months charting the islands, making contact with some of the indigenous groups, and eventually establishing a small settlement on the island that now bears his name. Blair's records provide the first detailed European observations of the Andamanese peoples. He described them as small in stature, dark-skinned with tightly curled hair. He noted their skill with bows and their reluctance to interact with outsiders. He also documented their boats, small outrigger canoes capable of navigating the channels between islands, but not suited for open ocean voyages. Notably, Blair's surveys did not include North Sentinel Island. His focus remained on the larger islands of the main Andaman group, where the potential for colonial development seemed greater. The Sentinelese remained unvisited, undocumented, unknown. The settlement Blair established failed within a few years. Disease swept through both the British colonists and the Andamanese they encountered. The position proved strategically less valuable than anticipated. By 1796, the British had abandoned their Andaman outpost entirely. For the next 60 years, the Andaman Islands returned to their previous status as a navigation hazard to be avoided. Ships occasionally wrecked on their shores. Survivors occasionally encountered the indigenous population, but no European power made any sustained effort to colonize or control the territory. This changed in 1857, when a massive uprising against British rule swept across northern India. The rebellion, known to the British as the Indian Mutiny and to Indians as the First War of Independence, resulted in thousands of prisoners whom the colonial government needed to house far from the mainland. The Andaman Islands suddenly became valuable again, not for their strategic position, but for their isolation. In 1858, the British established a permanent penal colony at Port Blair. Over the following decades, they would transport tens of thousands of prisoners to the islands, using their labor to clear forests, build roads, and construct the cellular jail that still stands today as a monument to colonial brutality. The establishment of the penal colony brought the outside world to the Andaman Islands in a way it had never come before, and it brought the first documented European observations of North Sentinel Island and its inhabitants. Early era. The British penal colony at Port Blair transformed the Andaman Islands from a blank space on the map into an outpost of empire. Between 1858 and 1945, an estimated 80,000 prisoners passed through the colony. They built roads and cleared land. They cultivated crops and harvested timber. They died in enormous numbers from disease, malnutrition, and the brutal conditions of their imprisonment. The indigenous Andamanese paid an even heavier price. The groups living on the larger islands, known collectively as the Great Andamanese, experienced catastrophic population decline. From an estimated 5,000 individuals at the time of British contact, their numbers fell to just 19 by 1961. Disease killed most of them: influenza, measles, syphilis. Their immune systems had no defense against pathogens from the outside world. The Sentinelese, separated from the main islands by 30 kilometers of open water, experienced none of this. No prisoners escaped to their shores. No missionaries attempted to convert them. No anthropologists landed to study them. The same isolation that had protected them for millennia continued to protect them through the first decades of British colonization. The first recorded European sighting of the Sentinelese came in 1867, when a merchant ship called the Nineveh ran aground on the reef surrounding North Sentinel Island. The crew and passengers, 106 people in total, made it safely to the beach. They spent several days on the island before rescue arrived. During those days, they encountered the island's inhabitants. The survivors reported that the Sentinelese attacked them with arrows and spears, forcing them to retreat to the wreckage of their ship. The rescue vessel that eventually retrieved them came under similar attack as it approached the shore. This account, recorded in British naval archives, established the pattern that would repeat itself over the following century and a half. Outsiders approach. The Sentinelese resist. The outsiders retreat. The island remains untouched. The most significant figure in the early documentation of the Andaman Islands was Maurice Vidal Portman, who served as the British officer in charge of the Andamanese from 1879 to 1901. Portman was an amateur anthropologist with a genuine interest in the indigenous peoples under his administration. He learned their languages, documented their customs, and photographed them extensively. Portman also carried out what he considered scientific expeditions, but what would today be recognized as kidnapping. On multiple occasions, he took Andamanese individuals from their homes to Port Blair, where he photographed them, measured their bodies, and attempted to learn about their cultures through interrogation. Many of these individuals died of disease within days or weeks of their capture. In January 1880, Portman led an expedition to North Sentinel Island. His goal was to make peaceful contact with the Sentinelese and bring back specimens and informants for study. He arrived with a large armed party, and landed on the island without opposition, the inhabitants having retreated into the forest at the sight of his boats. Portman and his men spent several days exploring the island. They found abandoned camps with still warm fires. They discovered paths leading into the interior. They saw evidence of the Sentinelese everywhere they looked, but the people themselves remained hidden, watching from the trees, refusing to engage with the intruders. Then, on the third day, Portman's party discovered an elderly couple and 4 children. The adults were too old or too weak to flee, the children too young. Portman took all 6 of them back to Port Blair. What happened next followed the same tragic pattern that had played out with other Andamanese captives. Within days, the elderly man and woman became seriously ill. They died shortly after, almost certainly from diseases to which they had no immunity. Portman, finally recognizing the danger he had created, returned the 4 children to North Sentinel Island as quickly as he could manage. Portman left no record of what happened when those children were returned to their island. He did not know whether they survived. He did not know whether they carried disease back to their families. He did not know whether the Sentinelese understood what had happened to their elders. But from that point forward, the Sentinelese hostility toward outsiders became, if anything, more absolute. Every subsequent expedition reported the same response. Arrows fired from the tree line, warriors emerging from the forest with weapons raised, unmistakable messages that outsiders were not welcome. Portman visited North Sentinel Island several more times over the following years, but he never made contact with the inhabitants again. He noted in his reports that the Sentinelese appeared to be a small population, perhaps a few dozen, or at most a few hundred individuals. He speculated about their culture based on the abandoned camps and tools he found. But he acknowledged that the Sentinelese themselves remained entirely unknown. The tools and weapons Portman documented on North Sentinel Island resembled those used by other Andamanese groups, with some notable differences. The Sentinelese bows were longer, their arrows fletched differently. Their camps showed less permanence, suggesting a more mobile lifestyle. They appeared to lack the skills of fire-making that other Andamanese possessed, instead keeping fires burning continuously and carrying embers from place to place. This last observation has been debated by subsequent researchers. Some anthropologists believe the Sentinelese simply did not make fire in the presence of outsiders. Others accept that they genuinely lack fire-making technology, one of only a handful of human societies in recorded history to have lost or never developed this skill. The British colonial administration, after Portman's expeditions, largely left North Sentinel Island alone. The Sentinelese had nothing the British wanted: no resources worth extracting, no labor worth exploiting, no souls worth saving, in the view of the missionaries who worked elsewhere in the islands. They were classified as a hostile, primitive tribe and effectively forgotten. This administrative neglect proved to be the greatest gift the colonial period gave the Sentinelese. While other Andamanese groups were decimated by disease and displacement, while their languages died and their cultures fragmented, the Sentinelese continued living exactly as they had for tens of thousands of years. The transfer of power from British to Indian rule in 1947 changed little for North Sentinel Island. The new Indian government inherited the Andaman and Nicobar Islands as a union territory, administered directly from New Delhi. The indigenous populations came under the protection of Indian law, at least in theory, but the Sentinelese remained as isolated as ever. The first Indian government expedition to North Sentinel Island did not occur until 1967, nearly 2 decades after independence. A team from the Indian Anthropological Survey, led by a researcher named T.N. Pandit, approached the island by boat to assess the population and make peaceful contact if possible. They found the same reception that Portman had documented nearly a century earlier. As their boat entered the shallow lagoon, warriors appeared on the beach. Arrows flew toward the vessel. The expedition retreated without landing. Pandit would return to North Sentinel Island more than 24 times over the following 3 decades. He developed a methodology for contact attempts that he believed minimized risk to both his teams and the Sentinelese. He approached slowly, in small boats. He brought gifts intended to demonstrate peaceful intentions: coconuts, bananas, metal pots, red cloth. The results varied. Sometimes the Sentinelese attacked immediately, firing arrows from the tree line before the boats could reach the beach. Sometimes they watched from a distance, allowing the gifts to be left, but showing no interest in engaging. Sometimes, individual Sentinelese would wade into the water to collect the offerings, studying them briefly before retreating into the forest. Pandit documented these encounters in detail, building a fragmentary picture of Sentinelese society based on what he could observe from a distance. He estimated the population at between 50 and 400 individuals, a range so wide it reflected how little he actually knew. He noted that they appeared healthy and well-nourished. He observed their weapons and boats. He recorded their vocalizations without being able to understand them. The coconut strategy became a defining feature of Indian contact attempts. The Andaman Islands do not naturally support coconut palms, and the Sentinelese had apparently never encountered the fruit. When researchers dropped coconuts into the lagoon, the Sentinelese retrieved them with obvious curiosity. They seemed to enjoy the taste and the liquid inside. They began appearing on the beach whenever they heard boat engines, anticipating the arrival of gifts. This represented a kind of progress from the perspective of the anthropologists. The Sentinelese were tolerating, even welcoming, certain forms of contact. They had not attacked in several consecutive visits. Individual Sentinelese had come within meters of the boats, close enough for brief, cautious interactions. On January 4, 1991, Pandit and his team achieved what no outsider had accomplished in recorded history. A small group of Sentinelese, men and women together, waded into the water and accepted gifts directly from the hands of the researchers. No arrows were raised, no hostile gestures made. For a few minutes, the two groups occupied the same space peacefully. Pandit described the encounter in his reports with evident emotion. The Sentinelese examined the coconuts and metal objects they were given. They allowed themselves to be observed at close range. They did not smile or speak, but neither did they threaten. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the interaction ended. The Sentinelese returned to the forest. The researchers withdrew to their boat. This moment represented the high watermark of contact attempts. It suggested that with enough patience, enough time, enough careful approach, the Sentinelese might eventually accept some form of ongoing relationship with the outside world. Then, in 1996, the Indian government made a decision that would shape the future of North Sentinel Island. They ended all official contact attempts. The reasoning was complex. The experience of other Andamanese groups weighed heavily on policymakers. The Jarawa, a tribe on South Andaman Island, who had maintained hostility toward outsiders until the 1990s, had begun experiencing the same devastating consequences of contact that had destroyed the Great Andamanese a century earlier. Disease outbreaks, social disruption, loss of traditional practices. The Sentinelese, policymakers concluded, should not be forced down the same path. Their isolation was not a problem to be solved, but a choice to be respected. India would protect North Sentinel Island from outside intrusion, rather than attempting to integrate its inhabitants into the broader society. A 3-mile exclusion zone was established around the island. Naval patrols began monitoring the waters. Fishing boats that strayed too close were warned away. The Sentinelese were granted, in effect, sovereignty over their own territory, even though they almost certainly had no concept of what that meant in legal terms. The policy remains in place today. India officially prohibits any attempt to contact the Sentinelese. Violators can be prosecuted under the Andaman and Nicobar Islands Protection of Aboriginal Tribes Act of 1956 and the Indian Forest Act. The penalties include fines and imprisonment. The Sentinelese themselves, of course, enforce their own rules. They continue to attack anyone who approaches their shores. They have not softened their position. They have not sought contact. They remain, as they have always been, a people apart. By the end of the 20th century, the Sentinelese had become one of the most studied, unstudied peoples on Earth. Researchers had compiled volumes of observations based on brief glimpses from boats anchored offshore. Satellite imagery had mapped every meter of their island. Government files contained decades of encounter reports, gift inventories, and policy recommendations. Yet the Sentinelese themselves remained unknown. No outsider had ever spent more than a few hours on their island. No one knew their language, their beliefs, their social structure, their history as they understood it. They existed in the anthropological literature as a series of questions without answers, a people defined entirely by what they rejected rather than what they embraced. The 21st century would bring new challenges to their isolation: a devastating tsunami, unauthorized visitors, a tragedy that would make headlines around the world. The Sentinelese would face tests of their defenses that no previous generation had encountered. The island frozen in time, North Sentinel Island, Vertical Bar Sleep Documentary Part 2, Rise. The British had learned their lesson. After the disastrous kidnappings of 1880, colonial administrators in Port Blair adopted a new policy toward North Sentinel Island, a policy of deliberate neglect. The island would be left alone. Its people would be forgotten. For decades, this approach held. The Sentinelese became a footnote in colonial records, a curiosity mentioned only in passing, an island marked on maps, but otherwise ignored. When Indian independence came in 1947, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands transferred from British to Indian administration. North Sentinel Island came with them. But for the new Indian government, struggling with partition, famine, and the enormous task of nation-building, a tiny island of hostile inhabitants registered as barely a concern at all. The Sentinelese continued their existence as they had for thousands of years, fishing in the shallows, hunting in the forests, living according to rhythms established long before any outsider had ever seen their shores. The man who would change everything arrived in the Andaman Islands in 1966. His name was Trilokinath Pandit. He was a young anthropologist working for the Anthropological Survey of India, assigned to study the indigenous tribes of the island chain. Pandit was methodical, patient, genuinely curious about the people he studied. He would spend the next 3 decades attempting to understand the Sentinelese, becoming the foremost expert on an island he could never truly enter. Pandit began by studying the other tribes of the Andamans, the Great Andamanese, the Ong, the Jarawa. Each group presented its own challenges, its own history of contact and conflict with outsiders. But the Sentinelese stood apart. They had never been studied, never been contacted peacefully, never allowed a single outsider to set foot on their island and leave unharmed. For an anthropologist, this represented both the ultimate challenge and the ultimate mystery. The first official Indian expedition to North Sentinel Island took place in March 1967. The Indian Navy provided transportation and security. Pandit joined a team of administrators and researchers. Their mission was simple in concept. They would approach the island. They would attempt to make peaceful contact. They would document what they found. The expedition anchored well offshore. Through binoculars, they could see the island clearly. The white beach, the dark jungle beyond, and movement. Figures on the shore, watching them. The Sentinelese had spotted the ship. they knew strangers had come. A small party went ashore in a dinghy, not on the main beach where the Sentinelese had gathered, but on a different stretch of coastline. They moved cautiously through the jungle. They found huts, abandoned cooking fires, pig skulls, evidence of recent human habitation, but no people. The Sentinelese had melted into the forest ahead of them. The team collected artifacts, baskets woven from plant fibers, arrows with tips made from hammered metal. The metal was significant. It suggested the Sentinelese had been salvaging material from shipwrecks for generations, transforming foreign objects into their own technology, adapting without truly adopting. When the expedition returned to their boat, they left gifts on the beach: coconuts, bananas, strips of red cloth, aluminum pots. These were items that had worked well in establishing contact with other Andamanese tribes. Perhaps they would work here too. They did not. The 1967 expedition established a pattern that would repeat for years. Approach, retreat, leave gifts, return to find the gifts either taken or destroyed. Never actual contact, never communication. The Sentinelese remained as unreachable as ever, but Pandit was patient. He understood that building trust with an isolated tribe could take years, perhaps decades. He advocated for regular contact expeditions, consistent, non-threatening visits that might slowly acclimate the Sentinelese to outsiders. The Indian government agreed. Beginning in 1970, official contact expeditions would visit North Sentinel Island on a regular basis. The first official contact expedition of the new program set out in early 1970. The approach was methodical. A motor launch would approach to within several hundred meters of shore. Gifts would be thrown or floated toward the beach. The team would wait. They would observe. They would document everything. On this first visit, the reception was hostile. Warriors appeared on the beach, weapons in hand. They shouted. They gestured aggressively. The meaning was unmistakable. Go away. Do not come closer. You are not welcome here. The team retreated, but they returned, again and again through 1970 and into 1971. Each visit followed the same pattern. Gifts were offered. Hostility was received. Progress seemed impossible. But Pandit noticed something. The Sentinelese were taking the coconuts. After each visit, when the team returned, the coconuts they had left behind were gone. The tribe was accepting at least some of what was offered, even if they refused to accept the people who offered it. The expeditions continued through the early 1970s. Pandit documented every detail: the construction of Sentinelese huts, their fishing techniques, the weapons they carried, their physical appearance. Most of what we know about the Sentinelese today comes from these patient observations made from boats anchored offshore, through binoculars and telephoto lenses. The tribe appeared healthy, well-nourished, physically strong. Whatever diseases had devastated other Andamanese populations had not reached North Sentinel. The island's isolation, so often portrayed as a limitation, was revealed as a profound protection. The Sentinelese had avoided the plagues that killed 90% of the great Andamanese. They had avoided the social collapse that nearly destroyed the Onge. Their hostility had saved them. In 1974, North Sentinel Island received an unusual visitor. A film crew from National Geographic arrived to document the contact expeditions. They were making a documentary about the Andaman Islands and their indigenous peoples. The Sentinelese would be the dramatic climax, an attempt at first contact with the world's most isolated tribe. The expedition that followed would become the most famous encounter with the Sentinelese ever recorded. The footage captured that day would be seen by millions around the world. It would define how people understood this island and its people for decades to come. The team approached in multiple boats. They carried an array of gifts: coconuts, a live pig, a miniature plastic car, aluminum cookware, dolls. The gifts were chosen based on what had worked with other tribes. The pig in particular was considered promising. Pigs were valuable to most Andamanese peoples. As the boats approached shore, the Sentinelese gathered on the beach. This was normal. What happened next was not. The warriors formed a line. They knocked arrows to their bows, and they waited. The team continued forward, calling out friendly greetings, holding up coconuts to show peaceful intent. The arrows came without warning. A volley of shafts launched toward the boats. One arrow struck a filmmaker in the thigh. The wound was not serious, but the message was absolute. The team retreated immediately. As they pulled away from shore, they threw the pig overboard, hoping it might swim to shore as a peace offering. The Sentinelese killed the pig. They buried it on the beach, along with the doll that had washed ashore. They took the coconuts. They kept nothing else. The miniature car was ignored. The cookware was scattered. The message could not have been clearer. They would take what they found useful. They would reject everything else, including the people who brought it. The 1974 footage went around the world. For most people, it was their first glimpse of the Sentinelese. The images were striking, powerful. Here was a people who had rejected the modern world absolutely, who defended their isolation with arrows and spears, who wanted nothing from outsiders except to be left alone. The documentary made the Sentinelese famous. It also made them a target. In the years that followed, the island would attract increasing attention from journalists, adventurers, and the simply curious. The very isolation that had protected the tribe was now threatened by their newfound celebrity. But Trilokinath Pandit saw something else in the footage. He saw patterns, behaviors that suggested the Sentinelese were not simply violent, they were communicating. The gestures they made, the way they positioned themselves, the timing of their attacks, all of it conveyed meaning. Pandit believed that with enough patience, real contact might still be possible. For the next 15 years, the contact expeditions continued, sometimes monthly, sometimes less frequently, always following the same careful protocols. Approach slowly, offer gifts, do not force contact, retreat at the first sign of hostility. The results were maddeningly inconsistent. Some visits provoked immediate aggression. Warriors would appear within minutes, arrows nocked and ready. Other visits seemed almost peaceful. The Sentinelese would watch from the tree line without approaching. Occasionally, they would come to the water's edge to collect the coconuts that had been floated toward shore. Once, a few men even waded into the shallows, picking up coconuts while the boats waited nearby. Coconuts became the currency of contact. The Sentinelese clearly valued them. Coconut palms do grow on North Sentinel, but they appear to be relatively rare compared to other Andaman islands. The introduced coconuts were larger, more numerous, more easily obtained than what the tribe could harvest themselves. Each expedition brought hundreds of coconuts. Each time, the coconuts were taken. Pandit noted that the Sentinelese had developed a system for collecting the gifts. They would wait until the boats had withdrawn to a safe distance. Then men would emerge from the jungle and wade into the water. They worked quickly, gathering coconuts and retreating before the boats could approach again. They had learned the patterns of the expeditions. They had adapted their behavior to maximize what they could gain while minimizing their risk. Through years of observation, Pandit and his colleagues pieced together fragments of Sentinelese life. The tribe appeared to number between 50 and 200 individuals, though accurate counts were impossible. They lived in two types of settlements: temporary lean-to shelters near the beach, used during fishing season; more permanent communal huts in the forest interior, used during the monsoon and for longer-term habitation. Their technology was sophisticated within its context. Outrigger canoes allowed fishing in the shallow reef waters. Bows capable of launching arrows with tremendous force could bring down prey and drive off invaders. Baskets, ropes, and containers woven from plant fibers served daily needs. They had fire, though whether they could make it or only maintained it remained unclear. They had no pottery, no agriculture, no metalworking, though they skillfully cold-worked salvaged metal into arrowheads and other tools. The canoes were particularly interesting to researchers. They were small, designed for 1 or 2 occupants, narrow and built for the calm waters inside the reef, not the open ocean beyond. This suggested the Sentinelese had no tradition of long-distance ocean travel. They did not visit other islands. They did not trade with anyone. They were truly, completely isolated, not just by hostility, but by technology. Their canoes could not have carried them to other shores, even if they had wanted to go. This observation changed how researchers understood the tribe. The Sentinelese were not isolated by choice alone. They were isolated by circumstance, by the particular development of their material culture, by the geography of their island. Their hostility reinforced this isolation, but it did not create it. They were prisoners of history in a way they themselves might not have fully understood. Peak crisis, January 4th, 1991. The day everything changed. The expedition that morning had begun like dozens before it. Pandit and his team approached North Sentinel in a motor launch. They carried the usual cargo of coconuts. They followed the usual protocols. They expected the usual response. Distant observation, perhaps a few arrows, perhaps nothing at all. But this time was different. As the boat approached the shallows, Sentinelese men began emerging from the jungle. This too was normal. What was not normal was their demeanor. They were not carrying weapons. They were not shouting or gesturing aggressively. They were simply walking toward the water, watching, waiting. Pandit made a decision. He would go closer. The boat moved into the shallows. Pandit slipped over the side into the warm water. He was now closer to the Sentinelese than any outsider had been in more than a century. Closer than Maurice Vidal Portman during his disastrous expedition in 1880. He was perhaps 20 meters from the nearest tribesman. He held out a coconut. The man waded toward him, then another, then several more. They were not armed. They were not hostile. They were approaching, cautiously but deliberately, to collect the gifts Pandit was offering. For the first time in recorded history, the Sentinelese were accepting gifts directly from an outsider's hands. The encounter lasted perhaps 30 minutes. Pandit distributed coconuts to men who waded out to receive them. Other team members documented everything from the boat. The Sentinelese took the coconuts and retreated to shore. They showed no aggression, no fear, just a cautious, measured acceptance of what was being offered. When all the coconuts were distributed, the expedition withdrew. Pandit returned to the boat in a state of near disbelief. After 24 years of attempts, after countless arrows and hostile gestures, the Sentinelese had finally, peacefully accepted contact. The breakthrough of January 4th was repeated several times over the following weeks. On February 14, 1991, another expedition achieved peaceful contact. Women and children appeared on the beach alongside the men. An elderly woman was observed sitting on the sand, watching the proceedings with apparent calm. The tribe seemed to be accepting that these strange visitors posed no threat. On this visit, Pandit noted something remarkable. A young man swam out to the boat itself. He climbed aboard without invitation. He examined the equipment, touched the metal fittings, looked at the researchers with what appeared to be curiosity rather than fear. Then he took several coconuts, slipped back into the water, and swam to shore. It was the closest contact any outsider had ever achieved with a Sentinelese individual. For a few minutes, a man from a Stone Age society had stood on a modern vessel, surrounded by the tools and technologies of the outside world. Then he had returned to his island, carrying coconuts, leaving everything else behind. The peaceful contacts of early 1991 raised immediate questions. What did they mean? Had the Sentinelese finally decided to accept outsiders? Were decades of patient, non-threatening contact expeditions finally paying off? Or was something else happening? Pandit was cautiously optimistic, but warned against drawing conclusions too quickly. The Sentinelese had shown they were capable of peaceful interaction, but this did not mean they wanted ongoing contact. It did not mean they were ready to be studied or documented up close. It certainly did not mean they wanted visitors. The gifts mattered, Pandit believed. The coconuts specifically. The Sentinelese had learned over years of observation that these strange people in boats brought valuable food. They had decided, apparently as a group, that the benefits outweighed the risks. But this was a practical calculation, not a cultural transformation. The Sentinelese were still the same people. They had simply found a more efficient way to obtain coconuts. The peaceful contacts continued through 1991. Each visit followed a similar pattern. The expedition would approach. Sentinelese would wade out to collect coconuts. Brief, careful exchanges would occur. Then both parties would withdraw. There was no communication beyond gestures, no understanding beyond the basic transaction. But there was also no violence. Researchers documented details they had never been able to observe before. The Sentinelese were of short stature, like other Andamanese peoples. They wore minimal clothing, decorated with plant fiber and shells. Their hair was worn tightly curled. Their teeth appeared healthy, an indication of a diet low in sugars and starches. They showed no signs of the diseases that had devastated other contacted tribes. The biological implications of the peaceful contacts concerned some researchers. The Sentinelese had been isolated for so long that they likely had no immunity to common diseases carried by outsiders. A simple cold could prove catastrophic. Influenza could kill half the tribe. The history of contacted indigenous peoples around the world was filled with such tragedies. The Indian government implemented strict protocols. Expedition members were screened for illness before departure. Anyone showing symptoms was excluded. Contact was kept brief and at a distance whenever possible. But the risk could never be eliminated entirely. Every visit carried the potential for catastrophe. The peaceful contacts did not last. In 1996, the Indian government made a decision that would shape North Sentinel Island's future. The contact expedition program was terminated. No more official visits, no more gifts of coconuts, no more attempts at peaceful interaction. The Sentinelese would be left alone. The reasons for this decision were multiple. Concern about disease transmission played a role. So did the experience of other Andamanese tribes, several of which had been nearly destroyed by contact with the outside world. The Jarawa, in particular, served as a cautionary tale. Initially hostile like the Sentinelese, they had eventually allowed contact in the late 1990s. Within years, they were suffering epidemics, exploitation, and cultural collapse. The Jarawa experience horrified administrators and anthropologists alike. Here was a tribe that had successfully resisted contact for generations, then been overwhelmed within years of opening up. Diseases swept through their population. Poachers invaded their territory. Tourists treated them as curiosities, throwing food from vehicles as if feeding animals at a zoo. The proud, independent Jarawa were reduced to roadside beggars. Indian officials looked at the Jarawa and saw the future of the Sentinelese if contact continued. Better to leave them alone. Better to let their isolation continue. Better to accept that some peoples cannot be safely contacted, no matter how careful the approach. The end of contact expeditions did not mean the end of interest in North Sentinel Island. If anything, the peaceful contacts of 1991 had increased global fascination with the Sentinelese. News of the brief interactions spread worldwide. Documentaries were produced, articles were written. The island became famous as the home of the last truly uncontacted people on Earth. This fame brought danger. Fishermen began approaching the island, curious about the people they had heard so much about. Adventurers planned unauthorized visits. Journalists sought sensational stories. The very publicity meant to protect the Sentinelese now threatened them. The Indian government responded by establishing a protection zone around North Sentinel Island. Vessels were prohibited from approaching within 5 nautical miles. Aircraft could not fly below a certain altitude. Violators faced substantial penalties. The Indian Coast Guard began regular patrols, turning back anyone who approached too closely. This protection was necessary. It was also imperfect. The Andaman Sea is vast. Coast Guard resources are limited. Fishermen in small boats could approach the island without detection, and some did. The Sentinelese response to these intrusions remained what it had always been: arrows, hostility, warnings to stay away. The threat outsiders posed to North Sentinel was demonstrated most dramatically not by deliberate intrusions, but by accident. On August 2nd, 1981, a cargo ship named MV Primrose ran aground on the reef surrounding the island during a storm. The ship was carrying a load of poultry feed. Its crew of 33 men found themselves stranded within sight of the most hostile tribe on Earth. The Sentinelese noticed the wreck immediately. Within days, crew members on the Primrose could see figures on the beach, constructing boats. They were building craft to reach the stranded vessel. The captain sent a desperate radio message. Wild men, estimate more than 50, carrying various homemade weapons, appear hostile. They are making 2 or 3 boats, worrying they will board us at sunset. The crew's weapons were limited: a few flare guns, some improvised clubs. Against the bows of the Sentinelese, these would provide little protection. The captain requested an urgent airdrop of firearms. The request was denied. Instead, a helicopter was dispatched to evacuate the crew. The helicopter arrived in stormy conditions. Extraction was difficult and dangerous, but all 33 crew members were rescued before the Sentinelese could reach the ship. The Primrose remained on the reef, slowly breaking apart over the following years. The Sentinelese salvaged the Primrose thoroughly. They took metal from its hull, removed useful fixtures, stripped anything that could be repurposed. For years afterward, arrows recovered from the island showed heads fashioned from ship's metal. The Primrose had become part of Sentinelese material culture, transformed from foreign intrusion into local resource. The wreck demonstrated both the vulnerability and the adaptability of the tribe. They could not prevent outsiders from reaching their shores accidentally, but they could absorb and transform what those accidents left behind. They had been doing so for centuries, perhaps millennia. Every shipwreck was an opportunity. Every piece of flotsam was raw material. The decades following the end of contact expeditions saw the Sentinelese retreat further into myth. Without regular observation, researchers could say little about how the tribe was changing, if at all. Population estimates varied wildly, from as few as 15 to as many as 500. The truth was that no one knew. No one could know. Occasional glimpses came from aircraft surveys after natural disasters. In December 2004, the Indian Ocean tsunami struck the Andaman Islands with devastating force. Thousands died across the region. Islands were reshaped. Entire communities were destroyed. Helicopters sent to assess damage to North Sentinel found something remarkable. The island appeared largely unaffected. The coral reef had apparently absorbed much of the tsunami's force. The forest stood intact. The beaches remained. And when a helicopter descended for a closer look, a Sentinelese man emerged from the trees and fired an arrow at it. The tribe had survived. The image of that man, bow drawn against a helicopter, became one of the most famous photographs ever taken of the Sentinelese. Here was a tribe that had just survived one of the worst natural disasters in recorded history. Their response to the helicopters sent to help them was not gratitude, not curiosity, just the same message they had delivered for centuries. Go away, leave us alone. The photograph circulated globally. It reinforced every narrative that had built up around the island. The Sentinelese as the ultimate resistors, the last holdouts against modernity, a people frozen in time, unchanged and unchangeable. Whether these narratives were accurate or not, they shaped how the world understood North Sentinel Island. The survival of the Sentinelese through the tsunami raised questions about their knowledge of the natural world. Had they somehow anticipated the wave? Had traditional knowledge passed down through generations warned them to seek high ground? Or had they simply been lucky, protected by the particular geography of their island? Researchers could not interview them, could not ask what they had experienced or how they had responded. The Sentinelese remained as silent to the outside world as ever. Their survival was a fact without an explanation. Another mystery added to the countless others surrounding the island. By 2010, North Sentinel Island occupied a unique position in human affairs. It was simultaneously one of the most famous places on Earth and one of the least known. Millions of people had seen photographs. Documentaries had been viewed billions of times. The Sentinelese had become symbols, representing everything from human resilience to the dangers of isolation to the last traces of a vanished past. Yet virtually nothing was actually known about them. Their language remained unrecorded, their beliefs unknown, their history unwritten. The peaceful contacts of 1991 had provided glimpses, nothing more. Everything else was inference, speculation, projection. The world looked at North Sentinel and saw what it wanted to see. The Sentinelese, meanwhile, continued their lives, fishing in the shallows, hunting in the forest, maintaining the traditions their ancestors had practiced for 50,000 years or more. They knew nothing of their fame, nothing of the debates about their future, nothing of the laws enacted to protect them or the schemes plotted to exploit them. They knew only that strangers sometimes came in boats, that these strangers left coconuts and other useful things, that sometimes the strangers had to be driven away with arrows, that the island was their home, their world, and their responsibility to defend. The 21st century would test that defense as never before. The island frozen in time, North Sentinel Island, vertical bar, sleep documentary, part 3, aftermath. The death of John Allen Chau on November 17, 2018, sent ripples far beyond the remote waters of the Andaman Sea. Within hours of the fisherman's report reaching Port Blair, the story had crossed oceans. International news agencies picked up the account of an American missionary killed by isolated tribespeople. The circumstances were extraordinary. A young man from Washington State, a forbidden island, a community that had rejected outside contact for perhaps 60,000 years. The collision of evangelical fervor and prehistoric isolation created a narrative that captured global attention in ways that few stories about remote indigenous peoples ever had. The initial response from Indian authorities was measured but firm. On November 21, 2018, Andaman and Nicobar police registered a case under multiple sections of Indian law. The fisherman who had transported Chau faced charges under the Indian Forest Act, the Protection of Aboriginal Tribes Regulation, and conspiracy to commit murder. 7 men were eventually arrested. Chau had paid them approximately 25,000 rupees, roughly $350, to take him to the island across multiple trips. The police named the fisherman and a local contact who had helped arrange the logistics. The question of Chau's body became an immediate diplomatic and practical challenge. His remains, according to the fisherman's account, had been dragged across the beach and buried in the sand by Sentinelese islanders. Standard protocol would demand recovery, but North Sentinel Island was not a standard location. Any attempt to retrieve the body would require landing on the island. It would mean contact with the tribe. It would potentially mean violence. The Sentinelese had made their position on visitors abundantly clear. Indian authorities faced an impossible calculation. Dipendra Pathak, Director General of Police for the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, addressed the situation in press conferences throughout late November. He confirmed that a joint team of police, Forest Department officials, Coast Guard personnel, and anthropologists had been assembled. Their mission was not to land. Instead, they would approach by boat and attempt to locate the body from a distance using binoculars. On November 23, 2018, the team made their first approach. They observed the island from approximately 400 meters offshore. They saw Sentinelese individuals on the beach. They saw movement near the area where witnesses said Chau had been buried. They did not see a body. The Coast Guard vessels circled the island at a cautious distance. Anthropologist Triloki Nath Pandit, then in his 80s, consulted with authorities about appropriate protocols. He had more experience with the Sentinelese than any living person. His advice was consistent with everything he had learned over 4 decades. Do not land. Do not attempt forced contact. Do not escalate the situation. The body, he suggested, should remain where it lay. Any recovery attempt would endanger the lives of the recovery team. It would traumatize the islanders. It might trigger retaliatory violence that could set back any possibility of future peaceful engagement by decades. Chau's journal, recovered from the fisherman who had transported him, became a crucial document. It revealed the depth of his preparation and conviction. He had studied linguistics, hoping to learn enough to communicate basic concepts despite having no access to the Sentinelese language. He had trained physically for years, building endurance and outdoor survival skills. He had written letters to his family explaining his mission. In one passage, he acknowledged the legal prohibitions against approaching the island. He knew the dangers. He went anyway. He described the Sentinelese as being held captive by Satan. He believed he was bringing them liberation. The journal also documented his final days in devastating detail. His first approach on November 15th, the initial volley of arrows, his retreat, his return on November 16th, the young man who shot an arrow that struck his Bible, his continued attempts at communication, the night he spent alone on his kayak, writing by flashlight, praying for success, his final entry, written before dawn on November 17th, his last words committed to paper before paddling back toward the island one more time. The Christian missionary community responded with a mixture of grief, defensiveness, and debate. All Nations, the Kansas City-based organization that had trained Chau, released a statement describing him as a martyr who gave his life to share the gospel. They compared him to Jim Elliot, a missionary killed by the Huaorani tribe in Ecuador in 1956. Elliot had become a legendary figure in evangelical circles, his death inspiring generations of missionaries to pursue unreached peoples regardless of danger. All Nations positioned Chau in this tradition, a young man who counted his life as nothing compared to the souls he hoped to save. But the comparison drew immediate criticism. Elliot and his companions had been killed during an era when indigenous rights were barely a concept. The legal and ethical frameworks of 1956 bore little resemblance to those of 2018. Critics pointed out that Chau had violated Indian law. He had potentially exposed the Sentinelese to diseases against which they had no immunity. He had ignored explicit regulations designed to protect one of the last uncontacted peoples on Earth. His faith, however sincere, did not exempt him from the consequences of his choices, nor did it make those choices moral. The legal response expanded beyond the immediate criminal case against the fishermen. International human rights organizations weighed in on the broader implications. Survival International, the global movement for tribal peoples' rights, issued statements condemning what they called a colonial-era approach to indigenous communities. The organization pointed to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, adopted in 2007. Article 8 specifically addressed the right of indigenous peoples to not be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture. The declaration had been endorsed by India. The Sentinelese, by any reasonable interpretation, had exercised their right to refuse contact. Chau's death in this framework was a consequence of his violation of that right. Diplomatic channels also activated. The United States Embassy in New Delhi monitored the situation closely. Chau's family requested that his body be returned for burial in the United States. The State Department communicated with Indian authorities about the possibility of recovery. Indian officials explained the constraints: the restricted area permit system, the Aboriginal tribe regulations, the practical impossibility of retrieval without potentially catastrophic consequences. Officially, the United States government did not pressure India to attempt recovery. Unofficially, the situation remained a sensitive point in bilateral relations for months. By December 2018, Indian authorities effectively declared the case closed as far as the Sentinelese were concerned. No charges would be filed against members of the tribe. They were classified as beyond the jurisdiction of Indian courts in matters relating to their own territory. The legal principle applied was similar to that used for diplomatic immunity, though the reasoning differed. The Sentinelese had never agreed to be governed by Indian law. They had never signed treaties. They had never acknowledged the authority of any external government. Charging them with murder would have been legally incoherent and practically unenforceable. The arrow that killed John Allen Chau was treated for legal purposes as an act of self-defense by a sovereign community against an intruder who had been warned. The fishermen faced different treatment. Their role as transporters made them culpable under Indian law. They had knowingly assisted someone in violating protected territory. They had profited from the arrangement. In January 2019, authorities announced that 5 of the 7 initially arrested fishermen would face trial. The charges were eventually reduced. None served significant prison time. The complexity of the case, the ambiguity of culpability, and the practical difficulties of prosecution led to a resolution that satisfied no one fully but avoided the spectacle of lengthy trials. Indian policy toward North Sentinel Island underwent review in the months following Chau's death. The existing exclusion zone extended 5 nautical miles from the island's coast. Questions arose about enforcement. The fishermen had penetrated this zone without detection. Chau had spent days conducting surveillance and multiple approach attempts. Where were the patrol boats? Where was the Coast Guard presence that was supposed to protect this internationally significant community? The answers revealed systemic limitations. The Andaman and Nicobar Coast Guard had limited resources. The island chain stretched across hundreds of kilometers of ocean. Priorities competed. Smuggling, illegal fishing, immigration from neighboring countries all demanded attention. North Sentinel Island, which saw perhaps 1 or 2 unauthorized approach attempts per decade, did not rank as a daily priority. After Chau's death, patrol frequency increased. New protocols were established for monitoring small craft in the vicinity. Electronic tracking requirements for fishing vessels were discussed, though implementation remained incomplete years later. The aftermath also triggered broader debates about the ethics of missionary work among isolated peoples. Christian organizations worldwide confronted questions they had largely avoided. Was it ever acceptable to contact communities that had rejected the outside world? Did the imperative to spread the gospel override considerations of public health, cultural preservation, and legal prohibition? Different denominations reached different conclusions. Some doubled down on the mandate to reach every tribe and tongue. Others acknowledged that certain communities should be left alone, at least until they signaled openness to contact. Academic anthropology engaged differently. Professional organizations had long established ethical guidelines prohibiting harmful contact with isolated peoples. The American Anthropological Association had adopted principles of informed consent and harm reduction decades earlier. The Chau case reinforced these principles while exposing the limits of academic influence. Anthropologists could study, document, and advocate, but they could not prevent individuals motivated by religious conviction from attempting what professionals knew to be dangerous and wrong. The Indian government's final position, articulated through multiple official statements, established a framework that would guide policy for years to come. North Sentinel Island would remain absolutely off-limits to all visitors. No exceptions for research, journalism, religion, or tourism. The exclusion zone would be maintained and, where possible, strengthened. The Sentinelese would continue to determine the terms of any future contact. If they chose to remain isolated indefinitely, that choice would be respected. If at some future point they signaled interest in engagement, Indian authorities would respond with appropriate caution and expertise. But the initiative would come from them, never again from outsiders bearing gifts or gospels or good intentions. John Allen Chau's body was never recovered. It remains on North Sentinel Island, buried in sand that has likely shifted many times since November 2018. His family eventually accepted that they would not receive his remains for burial in American soil. They released statements honoring his memory while acknowledging the complexity of his final decision. The evangelical community that had trained and inspired him continued to operate, though with somewhat greater attention to legal and ethical boundaries. The fishermen returned to their work, their brief notoriety fading as media attention moved elsewhere. The Coast Guard resumed its patrols, and on North Sentinel Island, the Sentinelese continued their lives exactly as they had before. A young man had come from the other side of the world to change them. He had failed. They endured. Legacy. The legacy of North Sentinel Island extends far beyond its approximately 60 square kilometers of jungle and beach. In the years since John Allen Chau's death, the island has become something more than a geographic location. It has become a symbol, a reference point in debates about colonialism, indigenous rights, religious freedom, and the limits of human connection. When policymakers discuss the fate of uncontacted peoples worldwide, they cite North Sentinel Island. When ethicists construct thought experiments about cultural autonomy, they invoke the Sentinelese. When filmmakers and novelists seek settings that evoke the boundaries of known civilization, they look to this speck of land in the Andaman Sea. The actual island remains as inaccessible as ever. Its influence has never been greater. Indian law regarding isolated tribal communities underwent significant refinement in the wake of the 2018 incident. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands Protection of Aboriginal Tribes Regulation, originally enacted in 1956 and last amended in 2012, received renewed attention. Legal scholars examined whether existing penalties adequately deterred unauthorized contact attempts. They debated whether the regulation should be classified as criminal or civil in its primary enforcement mechanism. The consensus that emerged favored strengthening both. In 2019, the Lieutenant Governor of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands issued administrative orders clarifying enforcement protocols. Coast Guard and police coordination improved. Reporting requirements for boats operating near protected areas became more stringent. The Sentinelese are not the only isolated community in the Andamans. The Jarawa, numbering approximately 400 individuals, occupy a reserve on South and Middle Andaman Islands. Unlike the Sentinelese, the Jarawa have experienced significant contact since the late 1990s. A major highway, the Andaman Trunk Road, passes directly through their territory. Tourists have been caught photographing Jarawa individuals, sometimes offering food in exchange for the opportunity. These interactions, while less dramatic than the events on North Sentinel Island, raise similar ethical and legal concerns. The legal frameworks applied to the Sentinelese have influenced policy toward the Jarawa and other Andamanese tribal groups. In 2019, the Supreme Court of India heard petitions regarding the Andaman Trunk Road. Activists argued that the road violated Jarawa rights and enabled exploitation. The court had previously ordered restrictions on tourist traffic through the reserve. Compliance remained inconsistent. The Chau case provided ammunition for those seeking stricter enforcement. If India was prepared to protect the Sentinelese from contact by maintaining an exclusion zone, critics argued, similar protections should apply to the Jarawa. The court issued directives reinforcing existing restrictions. Implementation continued to vary. Internationally, the North Sentinel Island case influenced policy discussions far from the Andaman Sea. Brazil's FUNAI, the National Indian Foundation, oversees protection of approximately 100 uncontacted or recently contacted indigenous groups in the Amazon basin. Brazilian policy has oscillated between protection and integration, depending on the political climate. The Chau incident provided a case study for advocates of strict non-contact policies. They pointed to the Sentinelese as evidence that isolation could be maintained over decades, that communities could survive and apparently thrive without external assistance, and that forced contact rarely served indigenous interests. The comparison had limits. Amazonian uncontacted groups face threats the Sentinelese do not. Illegal logging, mining, and agricultural expansion push into their territories continuously. Drug trafficking routes pass through remote forest regions. Armed conflicts between criminal organizations endanger anyone in their path. The Sentinelese benefit from geographic isolation that their Amazonian counterparts lack. An island surrounded by ocean and protected by reef is easier to defend than a patch of forest bordered by cattle ranches and gold mines. Still, the principle of respect for isolation found reinforcement in the North Sentinel example. Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia also host uncontacted populations. The Mashco Piro of southeastern Peru have been documented by flyover and occasional distant observation. Peruvian law, like Brazilian law, theoretically protects these communities from contact. Enforcement varies. Oil exploration permits have been granted in territories known to contain uncontacted peoples. The legal arguments defending such permits often hinge on economic necessity and the difficulty of proving precisely where isolated groups reside. Indigenous rights organizations use the Sentinelese case to argue that protection is possible when political will exists. The Andaman Exclusion Zone demonstrates that governments can maintain boundaries around indigenous territories. They choose not to in the Amazon because other interests take priority. The medical dimension of the North Sentinel legacy cannot be overstated. Public health experts have studied isolated populations for decades, documenting the catastrophic impact of disease transmission during first contact. The 1970 measles outbreak that devastated the Yanomami of Brazil killed approximately 15% of affected communities within weeks. Similar patterns repeated across contact events worldwide. Respiratory infections, influenza, tuberculosis, and gastrointestinal diseases spread through populations with no acquired immunity. Mortality rates during such outbreaks frequently exceeded 50%. The Sentinelese, with their estimated population of between 100 and 200 individuals, could face extinction from a single introduced pathogen. This biological vulnerability shapes every policy decision regarding North Sentinel Island. When authorities chose not to attempt recovery of John Allen Chau's body, disease transmission risk ranked among the primary considerations. Any landing party, regardless of precautions, would carry microorganisms the Sentinelese had never encountered. The risk was not theoretical. It was grounded in extensive historical documentation. The Andamanese Great Andamanese tribes, once numbering several thousand, were reduced to approximately 50 individuals by the mid-20th century. Introduced diseases bore primary responsibility. The Sentinelese survived precisely because they had avoided the fate of their neighbors. Modern epidemiology has developed protocols for reducing transmission risk during unavoidable contact events. Quarantine periods, vaccination of contact teams, protective equipment, and controlled introduction sequences can mitigate harm. These protocols assume the contacted population cooperates, or at least does not actively resist. The Sentinelese have demonstrated their resistance to contact repeatedly and unmistakably. Any medical intervention would require subduing or deceiving them first. Neither approach aligns with contemporary ethical standards. The result is a situation where providing medical assistance is both impossible and unnecessary, so long as isolation continues. The World Health Organization has developed guidelines addressing isolated indigenous populations. These guidelines recognize the unique vulnerability of such communities while respecting their autonomy. They recommend against contact unless initiated by the isolated group or necessitated by emergency. They call for rapid response capacity when contact does occur, with medical teams prepared to provide vaccination and treatment. For the Sentinelese, these guidelines translate into continued monitoring from a distance, readiness to respond if contact somehow happens, and otherwise leaving the island alone. Climate change introduces a complicating variable. Sea level rise threatens low-lying islands throughout the Indian Ocean. North Sentinel Island rises only a few meters above current sea level at its highest points. Models project significant inundation risk by 2100 under high-emission scenarios. Storm surge and coastal erosion may reduce habitable land area within decades. What happens to the Sentinelese if their island becomes uninhabitable? Relocation would require contact. Contact would require consent that the Sentinelese have never given and show no signs of offering. The ethical and practical dimensions of this potential future crisis have no clear resolution. The religious dimension of the legacy remains contested. Evangelical organizations continue to identify uncontacted peoples as priority targets for missionary work. The Joshua Project, a research initiative tracking progress toward the evangelical goal of reaching every ethnic group, lists the Sentinelese among approximately 7,000 unreached people groups worldwide. Their entry notes the extreme difficulty of access and the legal prohibitions against contact. It does not recommend that missionaries attempt what Chau attempted, but it maintains the classification of the Sentinelese as unreached, implying that reaching them remains an eventual objective. Other Christian organizations have moved in different directions. Some have explicitly excluded isolated peoples from their missionary strategies, accepting that certain communities should not be contacted regardless of theological considerations. The ethics of informed consent, they argue, preclude evangelism toward people who cannot meaningfully evaluate what they would be accepting. The Sentinelese have no framework for understanding Christianity. They have no basis for making an informed decision about conversion. Presenting them with religious material would be less like sharing good news, and more like imposing an entirely alien worldview without consent. This position remains controversial within evangelical circles, but has gained adherence since 2018. Academic study of the Sentinelese has effectively ceased. No researcher has had meaningful contact with the community since the early 1990s. The limited observations from that period, combined with earlier historical accounts, constitute essentially all that is known about their culture. Languages, religious practices, social organization, economic systems, material culture, all remain largely mysterious. Anthropologists interested in the Sentinelese can only analyze existing data, compare it with information about related Andamanese groups, and speculate. New primary research is impossible without the kind of contact that ethics and law now prohibit. This creates an unusual situation for a community that attracts such intense global interest. The Sentinelese are simultaneously among the most famous indigenous people on Earth and among the least documented. Millions have heard of them. Almost nothing is actually known about them. The gap between fame and knowledge may be unprecedented. It reflects both the power of modern media to amplify unusual stories and the limits that contemporary ethics place on acquiring certain kinds of information. Documentary filmmakers have attempted to capture the island from a distance. Drone technology theoretically enables close observation without landing. Indian authorities have prohibited such attempts, citing both legal restrictions and the risk that aerial surveillance might disturb the community. The prohibition reflects a broader principle that has emerged from decades of policy development. The Sentinelese have a right not only to be left alone physically, but to be left alone visually and psychologically. Their privacy extends beyond their beach to include their airspace and their right to live unobserved. The tourism industry has adapted as well. Adventure travel companies once offered expeditions that approached North Sentinel Island by boat, allowing paying customers to observe the island from a respectful distance. After 2018, most such offerings disappeared. The liability risk of approaching the exclusion zone increased. Insurance became difficult to obtain. More fundamentally, the ethics of treating an isolated community as a spectacle attraction faced increased scrutiny. Watching the Sentinelese from a boat, even at legal distance, reduced them to exhibits. The same organizations that had marketed such trips began distancing themselves from the practice. The Sentinelese themselves remain utterly unaware of their global significance. They do not know that their photographs have appeared in publications worldwide. They do not know that their existence has influenced legislation on 3 continents. They do not know that philosophers debate their autonomy in university classrooms, or that preachers discuss their souls in church basements. They know only that outsiders occasionally approach their shores, that these outsiders sometimes leave gifts, and that if not driven away, they may bring harm. Their response to this knowledge has been consistent for centuries. Resist, reject, survive. This consistency raises questions that may never be answered. Do the Sentinelese have oral traditions about the outside world? Have they developed explanations for the strange vessels and stranger people who periodically appear? Do their elders pass down stories of the British expedition, the Japanese occupation, the helicopter surveys? Or does each generation encounter outsiders as if for the first time, without accumulated cultural knowledge to contextualize the experience? The answers lie with the Sentinelese themselves. They have chosen not to share them. That choice deserves respect. The island continues. Its forests grow. Its reefs sustain fish populations. Its beaches collect debris from the wider world, plastic bottles and fishing nets that drift in from shipping lanes thousands of kilometers away. The Sentinelese continue. They hunt, fish, gather, build shelters, raise children, grow old, and die as their ancestors did. The modern world continues. It watches from satellites, debates in conferences, writes policies that will likely never be tested. The distance between these worlds, measured in nautical miles, seems trivial. Measured in everything else, it may be infinite. The island frozen in time, North Sentinel Island, vertical bar, sleep documentary. Part 4, the closing. And so the island remains. 36 square miles of forest and sand, encircled by coral, watched over by satellites that can read a newspaper headline from space. Yet what happens beneath that canopy stays hidden. The Sentinelese wake each morning to a world that looks much as it did when their ancestors first walked these shores. The smoke rises. The outrigger canoes rest on the beach. The children learn the same skills their grandparents learned, and their grandparents before them. We know almost nothing about their daily lives. We do not know what songs they sing, or whether they sing at all. We do not know their word for ocean, for fire, for love, for death. We do not know if they have a creation story, or what they believe happens to a person after they die. We do not know what they call themselves. Every name we have for them, Sentinelese, Sentinelese, the people of North Sentinel, these are names we invented. Their true name for their own people has never been recorded. This represents something extraordinary in the modern age. Not a mystery to be solved, but a boundary to be respected. A reminder that knowledge is not always ours to take. The history of colonialism is, in large part, a history of contact. Of ships arriving on foreign shores, of flags planted in soil that already had names, of languages imposed and languages lost. The pattern repeated across centuries and continents. When Europeans encountered peoples they considered primitive, they assumed a duty to civilize, to convert, to incorporate. This assumption cost millions of lives and erased thousands of cultures. The Sentinelese, through geography and determination, and perhaps some measure of fortune, escaped this fate. The British came and went. The Japanese occupied the Andaman Islands during World War II, but apparently never attempted to land on North Sentinel. The Indian government inherited the islands in 1947 and spent decades uncertain what to do with this small population that wanted nothing to do with the nation that claimed them. What the Sentinelese have preserved through all of this is something that can never be reconstructed once lost. An unbroken chain of cultural transmission stretching back perhaps 60,000 years. A way of being human that developed entirely independently of agriculture, of writing, of metal, of all the technologies we consider synonymous with civilization. They are not primitive, they are not backwards. They are a different answer to the question of how to live on Earth. Consider what we know of other Andamanese peoples. The great Andamanese once numbered in the thousands, speaking at least 10 distinct languages. Today, fewer than 50 remain, living in a government settlement on Strait Island. Their languages are nearly extinct. Their traditional way of life exists only in anthropological records. The Jarawa, who resisted contact until the 1990s, now face tourists who pay to photograph them like animals in a zoo, despite laws prohibiting such contact. The Onja number around 100, relocated to a reserve, dependent on government rations. These are the peoples who were contacted, who were studied, who were helped. The Sentinelese remain the only Andamanese group whose population appears stable, the only ones still living entirely on their own terms. The policy of isolation, whatever its philosophical complications, has produced a clear practical result. The people are alive. They are healthy enough to maintain their population. They are free. This may be the most significant lesson of North Sentinel Island. Sometimes the best thing powerful societies can do for vulnerable ones is simply to leave them alone. The world has changed utterly since Maurice Vidal Portman first stepped onto that beach in 1880. In the span of a single human lifetime, we have split the atom, walked on the moon, connected billions of people through invisible signals that circle the globe in seconds. We have mapped the human genome. We have photographed a black hole. We have sent robotic explorers to the edge of interstellar space. And still, 36 square miles of forest remains beyond our reach. Not because we lack the technology to land there, but because we have, perhaps for the first time in human history, chosen not to. This choice reveals something important about who we are becoming, or perhaps who we are capable of becoming. The old impulse, to discover, to conquer, to assimilate, still exists. John Allen Chau proved that in 2018, but alongside that impulse, a counter-impulse has emerged. A recognition that not everything belongs to us, that some doors should remain closed, that the right to be left alone is among the most fundamental rights a people can possess. The Indian government's exclusion zone extends 3 miles from the island's coast. Approaching closer is illegal. Making contact is illegal. The punishment can include imprisonment. These laws exist not to protect outsiders from the Sentinelese, but to protect the Sentinelese from outsiders. There are those who argue that the policy of isolation is its own form of paternalism, that the Sentinelese, like any people, have the right to make contact on their own terms, and that preventing anyone from approaching denies them this choice. The argument has some merit. We cannot know what the Sentinelese themselves want, because we cannot ask them without violating the very boundary their actions seem to demand. But consider the evidence of those actions. Arrow after arrow launched at approaching boats, spears thrown at helicopters, bodies buried quickly, faces turned away. For over a century, across every recorded interaction, the message has been consistent. The only language barrier that matters has been breached. We understand what they are telling us, even if we do not understand a single word. They do not want contact. They do not want gifts. They do not want our medicine or our tools or our ideas about how the world works. They want to be left alone, and so we leave them alone, not because it is easy, but because it is right. Perhaps the truest thing we can say about the Sentinelese is that they have endured. Through ice ages and warm periods, through the arrival of strangers in ships they could never have imagined, through diseases that killed peoples on every side of them, through a tsunami that reshaped their coastline, through the relentless expansion of a civilization that has touched every other corner of the planet. They endured because their island is small and remote and difficult to reach. They endured because they had nothing the outside world wanted badly enough to take by force. They endured because, when the moment came, they chose violence over submission, isolation over incorporation. And they endured because, in the end, the outside world let them. This may be the most remarkable part of the story. Not the Sentinelese themselves, extraordinary as they are, but the decision that was made about them. Somewhere along the way, the authorities responsible for their fate looked at the long history of contact and its consequences and said, "No more. Not this time. Not these people. It is a small thing, perhaps. One tiny island, one small population, a footnote to the vast and terrible history of what stronger peoples have done to weaker ones. But it is something. The campfires that burn in the forest tonight are the same fires that burned 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. The hands that tend them know nothing of the arguments that surround their existence, the debates about rights and sovereignty and the ethics of isolation, the anthropological papers speculating about their origins, the documentary you are listening to now. They know the forest, they know the reef, they know the seasons and the storms and the creatures that share their world. They know the faces of their families, the paths through the trees, the taste of the water from whatever springs feed their needs. That is enough. It has always been enough. Perhaps there is wisdom in that, in the recognition that a world 36 miles square can contain everything a person needs to live a full human life. That happiness does not require progress. That meaning does not require complexity. That the good life does not require any of the things we have spent millennia accumulating. The Sentinelese will not read these words. They will not know that people far away lie in darkness, listening to stories about their home. They will wake tomorrow to the same world they have always known, unchanged and unchanging, while satellites pass silently overhead and ships maintain their careful distance. The island keeps its secrets. The people keep their lives. The boundary holds. And in that holding, in that small and fragile boundary between their world and ours, something precious survives. A different way of being human. A reminder that the story of our species contains more chapters than we know. That somewhere, even now, people are living lives we cannot imagine, speaking words we will never hear, dreaming dreams we will never understand. They do not need us to understand them. They need us only to let them be. The moon rises over North Sentinel Island, as it has risen for 60,000 years. The forest is quiet. The reef glitters in the shallow water. Somewhere in the darkness, someone is sleeping. The world turns on.